Hope you guys had a good weekend. There's two objectives for this lecture. Number one, evaluate the smaller treaties of World War I. And number two, also review for our final exam by explaining how some of these smaller treaties reflected the causes of World War I. Just a reminder that these treaties were meant to prevent another world war. So two bell ringer questions. Number one is, do you feel that you control your identity, or does your environment control who you are? What most students said with this is that there's a balance of both. Is that they felt that they control where the country was going, they felt that they controlled whom they were, but only to a certain extent. Number two, why is voting so important? And also, what is the message of video clip? The message of what the video clip was, you had a whole bunch of Hollywood celebrities basically saying don't vote. Of course, they were being sarcastic, and what they really meant was, if you don't vote, these bad things could happen in our country. Well, what I started off class with was being kind of sarcastic and saying that I believe voting doesn't matter. I was actually surprised because a lot of students agreed with me. They said that politicians are corrupt, they don't represent what the people want, and they've lost faith in the system. Of course, I was being sarcastic, as I stated, and that's not what I felt. I tried to step in and basically say that voting and laws and voting and controlling where we want our country to go, it's won by smaller steps. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. Yes, there's problems in our country, but compared to the control that we have over our system, control over our laws, we definitely have much more control than some other countries that are ruled by a dictatorship or authoritarian government. And I'm very glad to hear also that there were a bunch of students that said voting was important. They felt that, kind of like what I was just saying, where it's not won overnight, and kind of those smaller victories in votes bring our country where it needs to be. So why vote? Our country, today we have self-determination. This means that each country should be allowed to govern themselves without control from another country. As a country, we pick our leaders, we design our laws, we're a free sovereign country. Although things aren't perfect, a lot of students said that politicians are corrupt and they do not represent the views of the people. Well, not every system is going to be perfect. And I'm going to bring up an example that Brandon actually brought up in 6th period, was with equality of men and women's rights. Brandon brought up, and this is actually a fact that I was just looking at in ABC News, was that men get paid 20% more than women do, despite the fact that they may have the same education. Now, if you look at the gains that have been made because of voting, we've definitely gone a long way. I mean, women were given the right to vote in our country in 1919, and from not having the right to vote at all to now graduating at a higher rate than men are in college and almost having equal pay. I guarantee within the next couple years or so there will be more equality come. So I don't want you to see voting and self-determination as something that happens overnight. It's a process. So what is self-determination and why is it important? Well, as stated, it's basically being able to rule your own country without guidance or without fear from what another country is going to do to you. Well, this reflects the cause of World War I. It reflects imperialism. Just a reminder, with imperialism, each country was trying to obtain more and more land to obtain resources, which could build up stronger and better arms. An example of this could be the Moroccan crisis, 1 and 2, could be the Boer War, and the Kruger Telegram. So, with these treaties made in mind, Woodrow Wilson and also the other government leaders of France and Great Britain wanted to make sure that they prevented another war by giving certain colonies in certain countries self-determination. But to what extent was it fair? Which countries were given self-determination? Were the losers in the war actually given self-determination? Okay, so the first treaty that we're going to talk about is the Treaty of Saint Germain. What you want to understand is, prior to this treaty, ask yourself, was Austria-Hungary one or two empires? Well, the correct answer was one empire, Austria-Hungarian Empire. And the goal of the Treaty of Saint Germain was to, of course, split those two territories apart, to punish them. So the Treaty of Saint Germain, what it did was split Austria-Hungary, but this specific treaty punishes Austria. One of the things that this treaty stated was the Germans and the Austrians could never ever form an alliance. In fact, a lot of Austrians and Germans basically saw themselves as a same nationality, the same customs, and splitting those two would hurt that sense of nationalism. The first thing they did was, on top of that, was they could not even have the same name. What the Austrians wanted to do was call themselves the Austrian-German Empire after being split from the Hungarians. Well, what the League of Nations decided to do was prevent that. Any association they felt with the Austrians could cause further conflict in the future. On top of that, what the League of Nations decided to do was change Austria's borders. These borders had a huge impact simply because it established nations such as Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. This is important because it dropped the Austrian population from 30 million to 6 million. Okay? On top of that, it reduced geographic area by 75%. Now, think about this. Prior to World War I, the Austrians and the Germans have spent many years basically building up their empire, unifying certain countries, certain nations. Now what this treaty does is it decreases that power. It decreased their sense of nationalism. On top of that, another thing that happened was more than 3 million people that spoke German, that considered themselves Austrian, were now considered Czechoslovakian because of the new borders. This goes back to self-determination. Think about it. Let's say if the United States went to war with Canada, and now, because we lost the war, everyone that lived in Seattle is now considered Canadian. Okay? How do you think those Americans would feel? Well, if there are people that have a strong sense of American pride, of course they would be extremely angry with that. Well, someone brought up in class, well, why just not move? Well, ask yourself this. If your country or if your family, your ancestors, established life there for hundreds of years, would you want to move? Okay? And also, it's very difficult to move at this time, simply because it's right after a war. People are drained of their resources. Families have been separated and killed because of the conscription and draft that were put in. So just to sum things up, why the Austrians were angry. Number one, think about it. If I told you you could no longer be friends with your best friend, well, you'd be pretty unhappy with that. That's what the Treaty of Germain did. It didn't allow Germans to be friends with Austrians. Number two, it changed the borders, and people felt this went against the concept of self-determination because many countries were forced to accept a different nationality and citizenship. So how does this relate to the causes of World War I? Well, number one, let's get the alliance system. Austria and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, reminder, made an alliance with Germany. And once Serbia did not accept the ultimatum, Austria declared war, which then caused Germany to cause war. So breaking up the alliance system was something that the League of Nations wanted to do. You could also make the argument that in terms of war reparations and also their military, the Austrians were forced to reduce their army, their military, and their navy to a number that they felt was not significant enough to threaten the other nations around it, but also enough where it was able to defend itself. In terms of war, so I guess you could say you can make the connection to militarism for that they felt that because everyone was building up their armies and militaries, that it caused that competition, which would later lead to war. And last but not least is war reparations. They did need to pay a certain amount of livestock and cattle to Italy and other countries surrounding the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, or what was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. But in terms of war reparations, originally the Treaty of Germain said that they would need to pay for the damage caused in World War I. Not to the extent that Germany did. However, Germany did feel this was unfair, simply because what the League of Nations did was they said they had to pay war reparations, but that amount was never established. Therefore, it was never paid at all. All right, next we have the Treaty of Trianon. Okay, as stated prior to this slide, that the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was now split. Well, this Treaty of Trianon basically punished the Hungarians. The first point says 33% of ethnic Hungarians found that they no longer lived in Hungary. Remember, one of the things that they did was they split up the borders, and when they redid the borders to basically create different countries such as Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungarians no longer found themselves living in Hungary. 33%. That's more than 2 million. That's a significant amount of people. On top of that, they were given 1 year to either move out of their newly formed country and back to Hungary, or else they would lose their citizenship. Okay. Now, many felt that this went against the idea of self-determination, especially if you look at the third bullet point where it says allies did not pay attention to their plebiscite. What a plebiscite is basically when a city makes a vote. When a city makes a vote for a certain legislation or for a certain law. In this case, there were many cities that were no longer in the Hungarian Empire, and they actually went to the Allies and they petitioned and voted and said, we want to be considered Hungarian. Well, of course, the Allies, who supposedly believed in self-determination, did not listen to the Hungarian needs. The second point you want to talk about, or I guess you could say the last point, is the economy. The economy of the Hungarian Empire, it really struggled. Main reason is because it was landlocked. The term landlocked means that you have no access to water, which means that you lack transportation. And because of this, grain the grain produce was basically decreased to 30% of what it was prior to World War I. On top of that, many of the successful financial industries and businesses that were in Hungary were no longer in Hungary due to the border change. So if you want to think about it, I mean, you look at the United States today, the largest cities, okay, historically there are two things that were near those cities that allowed it to develop. First one is the railroad, and of course the Hungarian railroads, they weren't as developed this time because of World War I, because of destruction that was caused. And also the second thing is you want to look at water navigation. You look at rivers, lakes, and Hungary lacked that, which basically prevented it from developing. Similar to Austria, Hungary did have to pay war reparations, and on top of that, their army military was also limited. So how does this reflect a cause of World War I? Okay, first thing I would say is nationalism and arms race, just like stated in the prior treaty. Is this broke up the Hungarian nationalism? If you are no longer part of your country or you no longer claim citizenship in your country, that's some anger that causes you because you have that pride. There was that sense of nationalism. And of course, the arms race. Because the Hungarian Empire had to take down their arms, their military, that reflects the competition prior to World War I on how each country built up their arms. Last but not least, we have the Treaty of Necqualie. What this did was it basically punished Bulgaria, who was an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary during World War I. And what this treaty did was it took the land of Western Bulgaria and it created a home for the Serbs, which they called Yugoslavia. A couple things that you guys want to look at is Bulgaria also had to decrease their arms just like Germany, Austria, and Hungary. And on top of that, they also had to pay some war reparations. What you want to look as a whole in terms of all these treaties is, did it punish them fairly? Obviously, all of these countries were not happy with the signing of the treaty because during World War II, when the Nazi regime came into power, Bulgaria, Austria, and Hungary all sided with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. So as you guys review for your exam, a couple things you want to look at is look back at your reading, look back at your class notes. I mean, look at this lecture, look at our prior lecture, and kind of ask yourself, what were the causes of World War I? We already established the Moroccan or imperialism, and you want to give me specific examples such as the Moroccan Crisis 1 and 2, the Boer War, Kruger Telegram, and you also want to look at another quite possible cause could be the arms race. Okay, and when you look at those causes, ask yourself, how does it reflect the treaties that were signed after World War I? If you have any questions, make sure you guys email me or ask me in class after viewing this.